Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of our webinar series with the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study. My name is Joel Anderson. I'm a professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Tennessee, and I appreciate all of you who are joining us today. If you have questions as we go along, please drop those into the Q&A, and I will answer those at the end of the webinar. As a reminder, this webinar series is in collaboration with the Carolina Aging Alliance, which is an organization based in North Carolina. And you can find out more information about the Carolina Aging Alliance by going to www.carolinaaging.org. And so today in our webinar series, I'm going to be talking about the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study. For the last 4 sessions, we've talked about issues that have affected LGBTQIA+ caregivers of people living with dementia and older adults. And today, I want to give you an update on the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study, how this webinar series came to be, what we're doing, and where we're going. So I do need to give a few little disclosures. So I am a board member, a member of the board of directors of Carolina Aging Alliance. I'm also a member of the advisory committee for the Aging Rainbow Coalition of Knox County. The research that I'm reporting today in this presentation is supported by a grant from the RRF Foundation for Aging. And so the content of the presentation is solely the responsibility of myself and my colleagues and does not necessarily represent the official views of the RRF Foundation for Aging. So before I get into the actual study, the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study, I feel like I need to give a little bit of background as to how we got there, how my colleagues and I got to this point, and how all of this was developed. So back in November, my colleague Jace Flatt from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I talked about some of the latest data around caregiving, and particularly LGBTQIA+ caregivers and older adults. But just as a quick little summary to give you some preamble as to why this study came about. The latest data from the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP from their Caregiving in the U.S. study from 2025 indicate that about 1 in 10 family caregivers or friend caregivers in the U.S. identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community. A third of them report that they have difficulty maintaining their own health. Now, this isn't uncommon for caregivers, particularly caregivers of older adults and caregivers of people with dementia. And 28% report that they have a fair or poor health status. This is self-rated health status, but a little over a quarter of them are saying that their health is fair or poor. Over a third report that they're caring for someone with an emotional or mental health problem, but the majority of them are not seeking assistance for the care that they're providing. So they're less often seeking paid help. Only about a quarter of them are seeking paid help, and less than half are seeking unpaid help. And this really jives with other data that we have collected from our studies that demonstrate that LGBTQI+ caregivers are less likely to engage in caregiver support groups or make use of caregiver support services that might exist in their community. And I'll give you a little indication as to why we think that's happening in the next couple of slides. 27% of LGBTQI+ caregivers report that they are unable to afford basic expenses. And let's keep in mind that these data were not collected yesterday, and so more of them may be reporting that now. These data are from the 2025 survey, so these data were collected around tail end of 2024, beginning of 2025. So at that time, 44% had stopped saving money, and about a third said that caregiving made them feel alone. And Jason and I also presented some other data from SAGE that he and his colleagues collected that one in 2 older LGBTQ adults reports loneliness or social isolation. So these statistics, while alarming, don't necessarily, unfortunately, surprise us. From our own research and data collected both at the community level and at the national level, we found that LGBTQI+ caregivers of people with dementia, here it says ADRD, that stands for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. We find that LGBTQI+ caregivers are younger, significantly younger than their non-LGBTQI+ counterparts. They're also more racially and ethnically diverse. Now, while younger folks are taking on caregiving roles more frequently, the average caregiver in the US is now under the age is around the age of 50. Still, we find that LGBTQI plus caregivers are taking on the caregiving role at younger ages, and that these caregivers are more racially and ethnically diverse. We also find, and that was borne out by the national statistics that I just showed you, that they're more frequently caring for a friend or a neighbor or someone with whom they do not have a marital or partnership or a biological relationship with. And these caregivers are also more frequently providing higher levels of care and more intense care. So what do I mean by that? They're more frequently helping with medical nursing tasks like managing blood sugar, helping people take care of maybe wounds that they might have, um, dealing with incontinence and helping folks with that than the average caregiver. And here's the information that I was talking about when it came to accessing those caregiving services. When we took the data that we had collected from a survey of LGBTQ caregivers across the US, and we compared it with equity scores related to policies and legislation and laws that either support or do not support LGBTQI plus folks across the country. When we divided those into low equity states and high equity states, low equity states meaning more discrimination, fewer protections against discrimination, high equity states meaning states that have higher levels of protection. Not surprisingly, we found that LGBTQI plus caregivers who were living in low equity states experienced more microaggressions, lower quality of life, and higher levels of caregiver stigma and depressive symptoms. So I'll unpack some of those terms. So microaggressions are those little things, those sort of death by a thousand cuts, off-color jokes, remarks, those types of things. You may not rise to the level of outright discrimination, but microaggressions have consistently been one of the strongest predictors in our research of poor health outcomes. And caregiver stigma is the stigma that folks might experience from being a caregiver. And that might be related to the gendered roles that we associate with caregiving. So we often associate caregiving with, quote, women's work. And so men, particularly gay men, taking on caregiving roles may be stigmatized by society because they're doing, quote, woman's work, but also stigma that's related just to being a caregiver, whether you're male or female, and sort of being outside of society or your social circles. It takes a lot to be a caregiver, and sometimes caregivers can feel stigmatized in the work that they're doing. And we found that those caregivers living in low equity states were experiencing more of that stigma. We also found that these caregivers, these LGBTQI plus caregivers who were living in low equity states, were less frequently seeking and using caregiver support services, and were less likely to report that their healthcare providers were asking them if they had what they needed. This wasn't necessarily earth-shattering. This didn't really surprise us a lot because, as we know, over the last several years, there's been a lot of policy pushes and legislation that has come into effect that has limited access to healthcare for LGBTQI plus folks of all ages. And so if you're a caregiver and you're looking for support and you live in a low equity state or a more rural area that may have more conservative political values happening, then you're less likely to seek those services out. So when we looked at all of this information over the last several years as we've been doing this work, we began to look at specific outcomes that we could address for these LGBTQ caregivers. What are some of the things that were consistently showing up that were more substantial or more intense for LGBTQ caregivers than for their non-LGBTQ counterparts? And we started looking around for ways that we could support these caregivers. We thought about, do we need to create a new intervention to address something, or there existing interventions that we could adapt and used to support this caregiver population. And that was one of the first places that we went, was an adaptation. And so that is where the idea for the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study came about. So what is this Savvy Caregiver? So Savvy Caregiver is an existing dementia family caregiver training program. It's been around since 1998, and it was developed by Dr. Ken Hepburn and his colleagues. And it has been used for now over 20 years to support family caregivers of people with dementia. There have been lots of cultural adaptations for different caregiver populations. And one of the reasons that it's consistently used in many communities across the US is because that it has been shown often, time and time again, to significantly decrease the distress that comes with caregiving, the burden that can come with caregiving, and depressive symptoms among caregivers of people with dementia. All of those are important outcomes for any caregiver, and substantially important for LGBTQIA plus caregivers. In fact, we found in one of our studies that LGBTQ caregivers reported rates of depressive symptoms that were twice as high as non-LGBTQ caregivers. So we were really looking for something that could help with that. And so Savvy Caregiver was specifically designed to address caregiver burden and distress, and it assists caregivers in modifying their caregiver behaviors by increasing their knowledge and their skills in caring for someone with dementia. More often than not, family members and friends are sort of thrown into the role of caregiving, and they don't really know a lot about dementia itself or what's going to happen or how they can approach all of the things that come with the caregiving role. Savvy Caregiver is theoretically based, so that's a very academic way of saying that Dr. Hepburn and his colleagues didn't just make this up. They based it on sound theoretical frameworks related to stress and coping and how we understand those things to work together. And it was tested using multiple randomized controlled trials, which are often referred to as the gold standard of interventions in health sciences and health sciences research. And again, across these randomized controlled trials, sometimes called RCTs, they found reductions, significant reductions, and meaningful reductions, not just statistically significant, but meaningful reductions in levels of caregiver distress and burden. And caregivers reported that they felt better able to do caregiving, to be in the caregiving role. So it increased their levels of self-efficacy, their confidence in being caregivers, their caregiver skills, and their mastery of caregiving. They also reported increased resilience in being a caregiver. And this is important when we think about, again, the influence of the microaggressions, discrimination, and stigma that's unique to LGBTQIA plus caregivers. So Savvy Caregiver with Pride was born, and we were fortunate to get a grant from the RRF Foundation for Aging. I am the principal investigator for the study, and this is the team. And it takes, to quote Hillary and others, it takes the village. And so this is a collaborative project between the College of Nursing at the University of Tennessee, we're the lead, as well as folks at the School of Public Health at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and the folks at Savvy Caregiver. So who are in these photos? On the far left, you see Joseph Knight, who is the project manager, the overall project manager for the study, both here at UTK and across the project. He helps me keep everything moving and everything going. The next photo is Dr. Jace Flatt, who is an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas School of Public Health. Jace and I have been collaborating now for a decade on how we can support LGBTQIA plus older adults who are caring for or experiencing or at risk for dementia. His project manager is Brittany Glenzar Castro. And then one of his graduate students, Aaron Rook, is also helping us with this project. And then the last two photos on the right are Dr. Carrie Wexler Sherman and John Hobday. They are the co-founders of Savvy Systems, which is the organization, the LLC that holds the intellectual property for the Savvy Caregiver intervention. And so Dr. Wexler Sherman is one of the folks who helped develop Savvy Caregiver, and she and John Hobday are the co-directors of the Savvy Systems and Savvy Caregiver. So we're working directly with the folks who have created and have been sustaining this program for the last couple of decades. Because we are taking a community engaged approach and because it's just important anyway, I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge who we are when we're coming toward this work, because all of us, whether we sometimes recognize it or not, can come to situations and work with our own identities and potential biases that we need to, particularly in a research standpoint, acknowledge to ourselves and take time to work through and make sure that those aren't influencing how we're doing the work. So many members of this project team identify as members of the LGBTQIA plus community, and several of us identify as women and or as caregivers, both past and present. So because we are working with LGBTQI plus caregivers, and caregivers are predominantly women, we want to make sure that our own personal lens and our own experiences aren't biasing what we're hearing when we're talking to other caregivers or what we find when we're analyzing our data. So it's important that we acknowledge those things. And in research, it's called bracketing, that we acknowledge it and sort of set it to the side and make any notes and work through what is ours and what's actually coming from the data. And then we also acknowledge the privilege that comes with our levels of education and our training and our socioeconomic class, our employment at R1 institutions. Those are high intensity research institutions like the University of Tennessee and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and the resources that come with those positions. I also want to take a minute and give a nod to the creation of our Savvy Caregiver with Pride logo. You may have noticed when you saw at the bottom of the screen the Savvy Caregiver logo, it was that sort of like little blue circle. That's known as an enso. It's a hand-drawn Japanese symbol that's common to Zen Buddhist practice. And I really like the symbolism of that because the enso can be drawn open or fully closed. It's usually done in one fell swoop. And an open circle often signifies movement and development. So I like the idea of we're helping caregivers to move through this process of caregiving to help them develop the skills that they need. Zen practitioners also can use or frequently use an enso as symbolic of the concept of wabi-sabi, or the beauty of imperfection. We're not always going to get things right. Caregiving can be challenging. You're not always going to get it right. But we're hoping that through Savvy Caregiver, and particularly Savvy Caregiver with Pride, we're arming caregivers with a set of skills that can help them support their journey. And so Joseph Joe, the project manager, reached out to a friend of his, Elise Lundberg, and she created the Savvy Caregiver Pride logo based on the ideas that we threw at her. And so it is modeled after the existing Savvy Caregiver logo. It is still an enso. And draws from that symbolism by representing the development of a savvy caregiver, someone who is knowledgeable and feels like they can take on this role, who embraces the journey of caregiving. And it's overlaid with the colors and the symbols of the Pride Progress flag to represent the strength and resilience of the LGBTQI plus community. So what are we actually doing in the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study? Well, we have two goals, two aims, two things that we want to accomplish during this research project. The first is to develop a culturally adapted version of the existing Savvy Caregiver intervention, and to create one that's specifically for LGBTQI plus caregivers of people with dementia. So as I mentioned before, folks have taken Savvy Caregiver over the years and have made adaptations that support Indigenous communities, Latino communities, et cetera, because every population of caregiver, they may have mutual qualities, things that everybody needs, but they also have distinct, unique needs that need to be addressed. And so this is the first time that Savvy Caregiver is being adapted specifically for LGBTQIA plus caregivers. So that's our first goal. We've got to make it. And then we want to see, does it work? Now, in research and science, that starts out with something called feasibility and acceptability. Feasibility is, can we, the researchers, do what we say we're going to do when we're delivering this intervention? And can the people who are taking part in the intervention, the caregivers, can they do what we're expecting them to do? So is it feasible? Will it work? And do they like it? Is it acceptable? Do they find it useful, or does it need some more work? And so those are our goals. We want to create it, and then we want to do this preliminary testing so that we can make it as good as possible before we would move on to the next step to see how well it may or may not improve outcomes for caregivers. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is this first aim, what we're doing to create the Savvy Caregiver with Pride intervention. So I mentioned our community engaged methods. We're working directly with the LGBTQIA plus community to make sure that what we're creating is coming directly from the folks who will be using it. And we're doing that in a lot of ways through sort of old-fashioned, traditional, in-person community engaged methods, but we're also using a lot of digital research methods and engaged methods. What does that mean? So we're recruiting folks online. We are doing interviews with caregivers online. We're both engaging with and recruiting folks into the study online, and we're collecting our data online, and we are disseminating our information online. So we're using a combination of these community engaged and digital recruitment methods because we found in our previous research that this works really well with LGBTQI plus adults and LGBTQI plus caregivers. And one of the things that we really like about it is that there are no geographic boundaries. Now, while we are limited to the United States, by working digitally, we can get folks from rural areas, we can get folks from urban areas. They don't just have to be from Tennessee or from Nevada or from Minnesota, where the offices of Savvy Caregiver are. They can be anywhere in the country. And we all know that social media platforms and digital spaces are used by a diverse population of folks in terms of age, race, ethnicity, levels of income, levels of education, you name it. And so by working in this way, we can better represent the full spectrum of LGBTQI plus caregivers and not just the usual suspects or people who are living close to our universities or people who might have advanced degrees, et cetera. So this really allows us to try to reach as diverse a population of caregivers as possible. So we've been using social media platforms, specifically Instagram and Blue Sky. We've been using word of mouth. We've distributed recruitment materials through community organizations and partners who serve the LGBTQI community with whom we have existing relationships. They've shared it with others. We've reached out to, you name it. If we can find you and if you come to us, we're sending out the information. And we've also used several research registries that are specifically designed to reach LGBTQI folks, whether that's through the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association or GLAMA or the Family Caregiver Alliance. We also created this webinar series. So this webinar series is part of that community engaged approach. My colleagues and I have the philosophy that the reason that we're doing the work that we're doing to improve well-being and quality of life for caregivers and LGBTQI plus older adults is to do just that, to improve quality of life and well-being. And there's no point in us sitting on information that we have or only publishing it in medical journals or talking about it at scientific conferences. We need to get that information into the hands of people who actually need it. So that's why we do this webinar series. It also allows us to give you updates about the study. It allows us to work with our community partner, the Carolina Agent Alliance, to address needs that are identified through their work in terms of what is needed in the community. So it's a way for us to make sure that what we are doing, one of the ways to make sure that what we are doing truly is community-led and community-focused. So we have two specific ways that we're getting information to more specifically drill down into how do we need to adapt this intervention? What do we need to do to Savvy Caregiver to make it more appropriate for LGBTQIA plus caregivers? One of those ways is known as a Delphi study. And in this photo, you see the Oracle of Delphi or Delphi in ancient Greece. And this is a type of research method that was created by the Rand Corporation back in the day to help get consensus and expert opinion and distill that down into something that you can actually use. So we start very broadly, and through multiple rounds of questions and surveys, and data analysis, we finally arrive at the core of the information that we're looking for. So we did a Delphi study with caregiving experts in LGBTQ health and caregiving, and particularly certified trainers of the Savvy Caregiver intervention to get their insight into what were the issues that they were continuously seeing when they were working with LGBTQ caregivers of people with dementia. Where were the gaps in the resources? What did they think was important for us to include in this intervention? So 13 folks participated in our Delphi survey, and the Delphi survey works by sending out a very broad survey electronically. They answer the questions, they give us our thoughts. We take those data and we analyze them, we distill it down, and then we ask them more clarifying questions. Okay, when you said this, what did you mean by that? Or you said all of these things were important. If you had to rank them, how would you rank them? In what order would you put them? And so we go back and forth until, again, we sort of take that wide funnel and distill it down to the essential elements. And so you see here in this table some demographic characteristics of the folks who participated in our Delphi study. So they were diverse in terms of their gender identity, sexual orientation, mostly white, mostly non-Latino. And you can see that they come from community organizations and service providers. They're certified Savvy trainers. They're health sciences researchers. They're healthcare providers. So they have a wide experience and expertise from which to draw. So what did they tell us? Well, through these successive rounds and going back and forth, the overarching themes, the main things that they told us is that there is a real lack of information and caregiver interventions that address the unique minority stressors and cultural biases that LGBTQ caregivers and their care recipients are experiencing. So what do they mean by minority stressors? So all of us experience stress in everyday life. And that stress can increase and decrease depending on what's going on in our lives or the external environment. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. All of us experience everyday stress. Minority stressors are those unique extra stressors that folks who have a minoritized identity might experience, whether that is a racially minoritized identity, or a sexual orientation or gender identity minoritized identity. And so those minority stressors are the stressors that LGBTQIA folks are experiencing that the population as a whole are not experiencing. So when we think about those policy initiatives and those legislative initiatives that are restricting healthcare or access to services based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and more often than not, limiting what's available to LGBTQIA folks, that's a minority stressor that other folks are not having to deal with. And so the experts in our Delphi survey pointed out that there really isn't a caregiver intervention that's addressing that. And that if we're going to work on adapting Savvy Caregiver to make it specifically for these caregivers, then we have to address those minority stressors. We have to talk about the cultural biases, why those are important to caregivers, and how those play a role in how they're delivering the care to their care recipient. That plays into that second theme of LGBTQIA plus specific resources. Again, there's not a lot out there that's been created specifically for this caregiver population, that's been tested over time, that's so-called evidence-based, so based on research that has been done over time. And in particular, If there is something, there isn't anything that's taking into account racially and ethnically minoritized LGBTQIA plus caregivers. Um, I was glad that our experts brought this up in the survey because we had found in previous research that racially and ethnically minoritized LGBTQI plus caregivers, so example, Latino LGBTQ caregivers have different experiences and different outcomes than their non-Latino counterparts. Same for African American and Black LGBTQ caregivers compared with white LGBTQ caregivers. And so they're just doubly minoritized, triply minoritized if you think about caregiver status, plus sexual orientation, plus race, ethnicity. And so our experts pointed out that we've got a tall order here, but we really need to think about the representation and making sure that we're addressing um, a whole array of needs as much as possible. They also pointed out that we needed to take into account the stigma and bias in healthcare and support settings that these caregivers and their care recipients are experiencing. I mentioned in a previous slide, when we looked at it by state level, we found that some folks were accessing these supports and some folks were not. And we assume that it's because of this stigma and bias. And then they reminded us that it's important to talk about the policy related issues, whether that's at the local level, the state level, or federal level, and how all of these are driving the ways in which caregivers are accessing services or the services that are available to them. So getting this information from experts is great, but we also need to get information directly from the folks who are doing the caregiving. So we conducted a series of interviews with current or former LGBTQI plus caregivers to understand their experiences and to get their opinions about how to make Savvy Caregiver more appropriate for this caregiver population. So here are the sample characteristics of the folks who completed our interviews. So we had 15 folks who completed the interviews. They ranged in age from 25 to 84. So we got a wide range of folks in terms of age. We got a wide range of folks in terms of gender identity, sexual orientation. We have a couple of folks who identified as transgender, and a few folks who identified as Latino. Again, a mostly white sample, but I was pleased that we got some folks with indigenous identities, as well as some other racial identities. A fairly well-educated sample in terms of formal levels of education, but a wide range in where folks were living across the US. So we have folks in very urban areas like New York City and very, very rural areas like a little small town in North Dakota, and everywhere in between. So we've got folks in the Southeast, Northeast, Northwest. We really lucked out there. And a wide variety in the amount of time that they spent caregiving, from a year up to 15 years. So a wide range of caregiving. And these were all self-described demographic characteristics. At the end of the caregiving interview, we asked folks to describe themselves based on these main categories, but we didn't ask them to check a box or tick a box. So what did they tell us? So we are still analyzing these data. So Aaron, the graduate student from UNLV, and I are still going through these interviews and doing the data analysis, reading through everything, and then going back and assigning specific codes or tags to passages that we're reading to help us distill down the information. Some of these interviews, when you transcribe them, it's about 4 or 5 pages of text. The interviews lasted anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. As you might imagine, some of those longer interviews are 10, 15 pages of text to analyze. And so we're going through them very carefully and using the words that the caregivers are saying themselves to create those codes and tags so that we can distill this information down. But what are some of the initial things that we're finding? Well, it's very much in line with what the experts told us and what our quantitative data from our previous surveys and analyses had pointed us toward. Minority stressors. These caregivers reported lots of different variations of minority stressors based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, but also in some cases their race and ethnicity. They also clearly indicated the lack of LGBTQIA plus specific resources. So one of the caregivers, I believe it was the caregiver who lived in Utah, talked about how they were taking part in an online caregiver support group that was for all caregivers. And they said that they listened to it on their AirPods during their walk and really didn't engage in the conversation because very rarely was there something that was specific that they could use to make their caregiving better. So they got more sort of general tips and tricks, but they really never got anything specific to their identity. The caregiver in that little town in North Dakota, a town of a few hundred people, talked about how there was nothing for miles and miles and miles and miles that was LGBTQ specific at all, let alone for caregiving. They talked about the bias that they experience in healthcare and support settings, from not being acknowledged by healthcare providers as the primary caregiver or the partner or the person making decisions for the person living with dementia, or in caregiver support groups, or when they would go to sort of typical places that we might expect them to find support. They were being met with some stigma and some bias there. They also mentioned a lack of support for younger caregivers within the LGBTQ community itself. So again, that caregiver stigma, sometimes just the caregiver identity itself, whether that's within the LGBTQ community or outside of the LGBTQ community, is leading to a certain level of stigma. So the younger caregivers talk about how their friends just don't seem to understand what caregiving looks like, why that means they can't, go out and be more social or do the things that their friends are doing, and how their friends just don't know how to be of support because they don't have those experiences. Several of them talked about the expectations to care for the family members, either because they themselves are unpartnered or don't have kids or both. And so there's this expectation that is frequently reported by LGBTQ caregivers that, well, you can take care of Aunt Sally because you don't have a family, so you've got the time. Or, well, you've got the degree and you've got the good job, so you have the resources that we don't have. They also talked a great deal about policy issues at the local, state, and federal level, and particularly the increased political scrutiny that's happened over the last year. So all of these interviews were conducted starting about this time last year and most recently a few weeks ago. So we're all probably pretty much aware of what's been going on in the US these days and how that has an impact on these caregivers. So again, the caregiver in North Dakota very much comes to mind. This was a caregiver who was also living with a physical disability, was visually impaired, so they couldn't drive, so they had transportation issues of their own. And then there was the caregiving transportation issues. And so they talked about how their food assistance had been cut. And when you are someone who lives a 90-minute drive each way to a Walmart or a large grocery store to get food, if you have transportation issues and your food services are being cut, and the only place where you can get food is the 7-Eleven down the street, it all adds up. And so lots of the caregivers talked about how things that they had previously were gone, or how they were afraid to seek services given the current climate. Several of them have been talking about how they would really love LGBTQIA plus specific support groups and resources and interventions. They talked about ways that they're trying to support their self-care, or how they need strategies to support their self-care and well-being. They talked about the need for safe and supportive spaces, for resources for advanced care planning for themselves and their care recipient, and financial support resources as the economy has changed and shifted, and more existing supports are drying up or being limited. So, as we continue this analysis of these interviews, we've already begun taking the information from the Delphi survey, the information from our previous research, and the information that we're learning from these interviews to create the adaptation of Savvy Caregiver, to create Savvy Caregiver with Pride. Now, we're not just doing that again willy-nilly. We're good researchers, so we have a specific framework that we're following to make sure that what we do is based on the research and evidence. So there are 5 points that we are considering as we go through this. Um, Peripheral, meaning that we are giving the materials the appearance of cultural appropriateness. Now, we're not just slapping a rainbow on something and calling it a day, but we do want to make sure that the images and the icons and the wording that we use is culturally appropriate. Evidential, so we're enhancing the perceived relevance of the issue of dementia and caregiving for the group. So we're talking about, or we'll be talking about in the materials, why there are unique needs for LGBTQ caregivers and the things that they need to be looking out for or thinking about. We're making sure that the materials are linguistically appropriate, that we're using cultural references that make sense. We're involving members of the group itself, the constituents, making sure. So we've got the caregivers, we've got the experts, and then the sociocultural aspects. So those minority stressors, those things that are unique and specific to this caregiver population, we're working that information in as well. So in terms of the peripheral aspects, we're looking at the images and the scenarios that are embedded within the Savvy Caregiver program, and we're making changes and revisions there to make sure that the materials look like the diversity of the caregivers that we're looking at, that the scenarios and sort of stories that are told within the intervention are reflective of LGBTQI plus caregivers. Linguistically, we're making sure that there's gender neutral language without, and we're providing specific information about misgendering of caregivers, why that's important, why it's important to be affirming, both from the aspect of the Savvy trainer, the folks within the Savvy workshop, or things that might be experienced outside of the workshop. Again, we're looking at LGBTQIA plus specific resources. We're creating the resource. We're making sure that we are addressing the needs of transgender older adults and caregivers. We're bringing in policy as much as we can, but understanding that policy changes day to day, week to week, month to month. And so we're trying to create something that has a little bit of staying power, that we're not having to update too frequently, but we've got to acknowledge the policy climate in which we live. Strategies to address the experiences of bias and discrimination, as well as to support self-care and well-being, advanced care planning and what that looks like, and how to manage the loss of identity for the care recipient. And that might look very different for an LGBTQ caregiver who may be caring for a neighbor or a friend or someone they've not known very long, versus someone who's caring for a parent or a longtime partner or spouse. We're also looking at the cultural biases and minority stressors, making this relevant, socioculturally relevant, the gender identity and misgendering and gender neutral language, what it's like to care for an estranged biological family member, how that affects the resources and the family support that you may or may not have, the stigma and the bias that might be experienced within healthcare and support settings, how to support or how to seek support if you're a younger caregiver. And this idea of this expectation that the family is going to place the caregiving responsibility on you. All of this has an impact, particularly in the final week of the Savvy Caregiver intervention, on how to create a network of support for yourself. So Savvy Caregiver has a lot of elements that it covers, and here's the bulleted list there. I won't go into all of these, but the ones that are highlighted in purple are the ones that we have so far clearly identified as places where we can add this adapted information, where we can expand the information that's provided, whether that's the risk for dementia diseases, which is heightened within the LGBTQ community, caregiver self-care and how that might look different for these caregivers, and decision-making and family support, because there may be a lot of surrogate decision-making, meaning you're making decisions on behalf of someone with whom you may not have a biological relationship, and what family looks like, and whether or not you have biological family support, support from chosen family, and what community resources may or may not look like. So in terms of dementia diseases, again, making it specific for the full LGBTQ caregiver population. So not dropping transgender caregivers and making sure that everybody we're hitting as many important points as we can. Thinking about the self-care and how that can look different for LGBTQ caregivers. And thinking about the policy issues, the decision making, the advanced care planning, what's going to be expected of you as a caregiver, and how to navigate this in a potential sea of stigma and bias, whether that's coming from healthcare providers, support settings, or estranged or biological family members. Now, that's a tall order. And we're actually taking a nod from the adaptation of Savvy Caregiver that was created for Native American and Indigenous populations. Um, they created a companion, in addition to going through and making a revision to the existing Savvy Caregiver materials, they created a companion booklet that gave sort of an explanation as to why this was important, and then a companion text that gave specific information in call out boxes that were highlighted by an icon so that they were easy to find for the caregiver, for the trainer, and anyone who might be coming along later to update the materials. And we really liked that format and appreciate the work that they did. And so we're using our Savvy Caregiver logo in lavender call out boxes. So using the color lavender, given its longtime symbolism within the LGBTQ community, to create specific spaces in which we can supplement the narratives and the information that exists in the Savvy Caregiver program, because we don't want to completely reinvent the wheel. We want to augment. And so providing useful information to the folks who are delivering the intervention, for the caregivers who are experiencing the intervention, and then creating a companion booklet that expands on resources, gives links to websites, may talk about the policy issues and some of the things that are not currently specifically part of the Savvy Caregiver intervention, but may over time be incorporated in not only into Savvy Caregiver with Pride, but maybe Savvy Caregiver overall. Because Savvy Caregiver is a living intervention. Over the last 20 years, it's been adapted and refined and revised. And so when we've been talking with Dr. Wexler Sherman and Mr. Hobday about these things, that we've talked about how, this is a substantive, meaningful adaptation, not only for LGBTQ caregivers, but for Savvy as a whole, and sort of bringing it into the now. So we're really excited about that and what that looks like. So that's where we are right now. We're in the process of creating those materials so that in the next couple of months, we can begin testing them. And that's going to look like folks engaging in online Savvy Caregiver workshops. So a typical Savvy Caregiver workshop is 6 weekly sessions. Each session is 2 hours long. And so we're going to deliver all this online via Zoom. And so folks who are interested in the Savvy Caregiver in taking part, folks who are a current caregiver and interested in taking part in this next part, can email us. We'll also be sending out the study information and the flyers when we're ready to launch to all the folks who have registered for this webinar and previous webinars, as well as using all the strategies that we've used before. And so folks would take part in the workshop. They would complete some online surveys at the very beginning. They would complete some online surveys 6 weeks after they complete the workshop. And then 4 weeks later, they'd complete another set of surveys so that we can see, what did you learn? And did the things that you learned, were those sustained? And we'll have folks who receive the existing Savvy Caregiver intervention with no adaptations. And then we'll have folks who receive the Savvy Caregiver with Pride adaptation. That said, if for some reason a participant ended up in the control group, the standard Savvy Caregiver group, at the end of that intervention, they would be provided with the adapted Savvy Caregiver with Pride. So everybody's going to get Savvy Caregiver with Pride. It's just that the folks in the control group are going to have to wait. And we're randomizing at the level of the workshop. So when folks email us or contact us and they're interested in participating, once we screen them for eligibility, we will schedule them for the workshop that works with their schedule. And then on the back end, we've got the randomization. So again, they may end up in a control, they may end up in the adapted, but it's all going to be as seamless and easy as possible, hopefully, for those caregivers. And so we'll be offering them online at different times of the week and at different times of the day so that we can address the needs of caregivers as best as possible. So if you're interested, please send us an email, or as I said, the webinar registration is one way that we are disseminating the information out. So we'll be getting that out to folks who registered for the webinar. And with that, I really want to thank you for participating in the webinar. Hopefully this was useful information, or at least interesting information. And I am happy to answer any questions that might be in the Q&A. You can also find us on Instagram at Savvy with Pride. And again, our email address, savvy@utk.edu. And all of the episodes of the webinar series are being recorded, and then they're being uploaded to the Carolina Aging Alliance YouTube channel. So if you're interested in going back and looking to see any of the previous presentations that we've done, you can find them there. And our next webinar will be in August, and it will focus on transgender health. So I do not see any questions in the Q&A. So in the interest of time, I will go ahead and close out the webinar, but we really appreciate your participation. Please let us know if you're interested in the study or learning more, and we look forward to seeing folks in August for the next webinar.